A woman walks into a Walmart in Ohio at 8:30 inches the morning, and the shelves are half empty. Not because people panic bought supplies, not because of a storm, because the store is shutting down forever. And the strangest part? Most people in town already knew it was coming. The cashiers knew. The truck drivers knew. Even the customers knew. But corporate kept saying the same thing. American corporations always say, consumer behavior is evolving. That phrase sounds clean, professional, harmless. But what it really means is this. The economic system that built modern suburban America is quietly breaking apart, aisle by aisle. In 2026, some of the biggest retailers in the United States are closing stores across the country. Walgreens, Macy's, Family Dollar, CVS, Rite Aid, Big Lots, Foot Locker, even brands that once felt untouchable are shrinking in front of our eyes. And at first glance, this looks like a business story. Bad management, online shopping, inflation. Simple. Except it isn't simple at all. Because when giant retailers start disappearing everywhere at the same time, it usually means something deeper is happening underneath the surface of society itself. And this is where things get uncomfortable. For decades, Americans were told a certain story about stability. Go to school, get a job, buy a house near a shopping center, raise a family, consume, repeat. Retail stores weren't just stores. They became physical proof that the American middle class was functioning. Every strip mall, every glowing pharmacy sign at midnight, every giant parking lot filled with SUVs, it all symbolized permanence. That's why these closures feel so unsettling, even if people barely shop there anymore. Because subconsciously, Americans associate big retail chains with social order itself. And when those chains begin collapsing, people start sensing something they can't fully explain. Maybe the system isn't as stable as it pretended to be. But here's the part nobody talks about. These companies are not dying suddenly. Many of them have been slowly bleeding for years, while pretending everything was normal. Take Walgreens. For years, thousands of locations stayed open despite declining foot traffic, rising theft, staffing shortages, and shrinking prescription profits. The stores still looked operational from the outside. Bright lights, weekly discounts, shelves stocked with candy and shampoo. But internally, margins were collapsing. Employees were burning out. Entire locations became financially unsustainable. And yet they kept expanding. Why? Because modern corporations are often rewarded for looking healthy, even when they aren't. That's one of the hidden contradictions inside American capitalism. Growth matters more than stability. Optics matter more than resilience. A company can quietly decay for years, as long as quarterly reports still create the illusion of momentum. And retail became the perfect example of that illusion. Huge stores, huge inventories, huge debt, huge promises. But underneath it all, shrinking communities, with less spending power than before. And you can actually see this transformation happening in real time across America. Drive through certain suburbs today, and you'll notice something eerie. The stores are technically open, but they feel emotionally abandoned. Dim lighting, few workers, locked up products behind glass, self-checkout machines replacing conversations, entire aisles nobody walks through anymore. It feels less like commerce and more like infrastructure slowly being hollowed out from the inside. Almost like America built too much retail for an economy that no longer exists. And maybe that's exactly what happened. Back in the 1980s and 90s, the US aggressively expanded consumer culture. Malls exploded. Big box chains spread everywhere. Retail became one of the largest employers in the country. But the model depended on one critical assumption: that the average American consumer would continue getting stronger financially over time. Instead, the opposite happened. Housing costs exploded. Healthcare costs exploded. Education costs exploded. Meanwhile, many wages stagnated for decades. So Americans adapted psychologically. They stopped browsing, stopped wandering malls for fun, stopped buying casually. Shopping became transactional, efficient, emotionless. People don't hang out in stores the way they used to because financially, many no longer feel relaxed enough to. And once retail loses emotional energy, the entire experience changes. That's why so many stores today feel strangely lifeless even before they close. At first, this looks like a story about stores disappearing, but it's really a story about what happens when an entire society quietly loses confidence in its own future. And if you've noticed that feeling too, that strange sense that modern life feels more temporary than it used to, you're not imagining it. That's part of why conversations like this matter, because sometimes the biggest changes in society don't begin with riots or crashes. They begin with empty aisles no one talks about. In many American towns, the first sign of economic decline is no longer a factory shutting down. It's a pharmacy. And that says something profound about the country America has become. Think about it. Factories disappearing represented the loss of production, but pharmacies disappearing? That represents the collapse of everyday stability itself. Prescription access, basic groceries, household essentials, human interaction. For millions of Americans, especially elderly people, stores like CVS or Walgreens are not just retail locations. They are part of the emotional infrastructure of daily life. That's why these closures hit differently. And here's the part that makes this story darker than most headlines admit. A lot of these stores are closing in places that already feel forgotten. Low-income neighborhoods, suburbs, small towns, communities where people already feel economically stranded. So when a retailer leaves, it doesn't just remove products, it removes confidence. A dark storefront has psychological consequences. People read abandonment physically. An empty building silently communicates. No one is investing here anymore. And once enough empty buildings appear in one area, something strange begins happening socially. People stop imagining a future there. That's the invisible side of retail collapse. Nobody measures in earnings reports. Hope erosion, because economic decline rarely arrives dramatically. Usually, it arrives quietly. One closed store, one shorter operating hour, one empty parking lot, one missing employee, until eventually, people wake up and realize the environment around them no longer feels alive. But corporations will never describe it that way. They'll say things like portfolio optimization, strategic restructuring, footprint reduction, cold language, clinical language, language designed to hide emotional reality. Because if companies describe these closures honestly, they'd have to admit something terrifying. The consumer economy that dominated America for 40 years is no longer functioning the way it once did. And you can see the evidence everywhere. Malls becoming medical centers, former department stores becoming warehouses, huge retail spaces converted into churches, gyms, storage facilities, or simply left empty for years. Entire pieces of American culture being repurposed because the original economic engine stopped working. And this is where things get deeply ironic. For years, Americans were told online shopping would create more convenience, more freedom, more efficiency. And technically, it did. But efficiency has psychological side effects. Amazon didn't just change shopping, it changed human behavior. People became less patient, less exploratory, less socially connected during consumption. Shopping transformed from an experience into a delivery system. Click, buy, done. No wandering, no accidental discovery, no casual conversations, no sense of public space. At first, that sounds minor, but multiply that behavioral shift across hundreds of millions of people over 20 years, and entire physical industries start collapsing. Because retail was never only about products. It was about ritual. Teenagers hanging out at malls, families shopping together on weekends, older people chatting with workers they recognized. Even boredom itself once played a role in commerce. Now boredom gets absorbed by phones before people ever leave the house. And this is where things become psychologically fascinating. Americans today consume more content than ever, but participate in public life less and less. The country is becoming digitally crowded but physically isolated, and retail closures are partially a symptom of that transformation. Stores are disappearing because the social behaviors supporting them are disappearing too. But here's what makes 2026 feel different. This time, even discount retailers are struggling. That matters, because discount chains usually thrive during economic pressure. Historically, when Americans felt financially squeezed, they traded down. Dollar stores grew, budget chains expanded, off-price retail exploded. But now, even some low-cost retailers are shutting locations, which suggests something more serious may be happening. The consumer isn't merely budget conscious anymore. The consumer is exhausted, financially exhausted, emotionally exhausted, decision fatigued. People are spending less not only because prices are high, but because uncertainty changes human psychology. When people stop trusting the future, they stop spending like optimistic citizens and start spending like survivors. And survival spending looks very different. Fewer impulse purchases, fewer luxuries, more caution, more hesitation, more invisible fear. That fear spreads slowly through the economy like cold air entering a house through tiny cracks. At first, nobody notices. Then suddenly, everything feels colder. And this is where the retail story becomes bigger than retail itself. Because these store closures are exposing something many Americans secretly feel but rarely say out loud. The old version of the American dream depended heavily on endless consumption. Not happiness, not community, not meaning. Consumption, buy more, upgrade more, expand more. And, for a while, it worked well enough to keep the system emotionally believable. But now, millions of people are starting to sense the limits of that model, especially younger generations. Many don't believe they'll own homes. Many are drowning in debt. Many feel economically locked out of the life their parents considered normal. So naturally, their relationship with consumption changes too. Why emotionally invest in a system that no longer feels capable of rewarding you? And once enough people begin feeling that way, the entire economy starts shifting underneath the surface. Quietly, gradually, then all at once. If this conversation resonates with you, subscribe not because of algorithms or metrics, but because these changes deserve deeper conversations than the headlines usually allow. Because what's happening in retail is really a mirror, and the reflection is showing Americans something they're not fully ready to confront yet. There's a reason abandoned malls feel almost haunting. Not just empty, haunting, because they contain the remains of a future people once believed in. Walk through a dead shopping mall in America today, and you'll notice something unsettling almost immediately. The architecture still expects crowds. The escalators still rise dramatically toward nowhere. The food court still has giant seating areas built for hundreds of conversations that never happen anymore. It feels like walking through the fossil of an economic religion. And in many ways, that's exactly what it is. For decades, consumerism wasn't simply part of American life. It was American life. Success became visual, visible, measurable. The bigger house, the newer car, the upgraded kitchen, the shopping bags, the brands. Retail stores became modern temples, where people went not only to buy things, but to reinforce identity itself. That's why the collapse of physical retail creates such a strange emotional reaction, even among people who barely shop there anymore. Because subconsciously, these places represented continuity, predictability, a sense that society was still functioning according to familiar rules. And now those rules are breaking apart in public view. But here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Not all retail is dying equally. Luxury brands still survive. High-end experiences still attract customers. Wealthy consumers still spend aggressively. In fact, in some parts of America, consumption looks stronger than ever. And that reveals a deeper truth hiding underneath the closure headlines. This isn't just a retail collapse. It's a fragmentation collapse. America is increasingly splitting into separate economic realities. One America still consumes comfortably. Another America is quietly retreating from public economic life altogether. And retailers are being forced to adapt to that divide. That's why middle-market chains are getting crushed so hard. Historically, the American middle class was large enough to sustain enormous retail ecosystems. Department stores thrived because millions of families occupied roughly similar economic ground. But now, that middle ground is eroding. The economy is becoming polarized, which means retail becomes polarized too. Discount chains on one side, luxury experiences on the other, and the broad middle begins disappearing. This pattern shows up everywhere once you start noticing it. Airlines, restaurants, housing, healthcare, education, even dating culture increasingly reflects economic separation. And this is where things get psychologically dangerous for a society. Because stable countries depend heavily on the existence of a believable middle, not just economically, emotionally. People need to feel that ordinary effort still leads somewhere, that stability is achievable, that the future can still be planned. But when enough people lose faith in upward mobility, strange social behaviors emerge. Anger increases, distrust increases, escapism increases. People either become hyper-consumers chasing status or emotionally detach from the system entirely. And retail closures quietly reveal both reactions happening simultaneously. Some Americans are spending thousands on luxury wellness products, exclusive memberships, and premium experiences. Others are financing groceries through installment payment apps. Same country, completely different realities. And corporations understand this shift better than most politicians do. That's why so many companies are shrinking physical presence while investing heavily into data, automation, and digital ecosystems. Because from a corporate perspective, physical stores are messy, humans are messy, theft, maintenance, employee turnover, security costs, local economic instability. Digital systems are cleaner, more predictable, more controllable. But there's a hidden social cost to replacing physical environments with digital convenience. Communities become thinner, more transactional, less human. And this is the contradiction at the center of modern American life. Technology keeps making life more efficient, while simultaneously making society feel less emotionally connected. People can order products faster than ever, yet loneliness keeps rising. People can access endless entertainment instantly, yet anxiety keeps rising. People are more digitally connected than any civilization in history, yet increasingly disconnected from physical communal spaces. Retail stores once acted as accidental social environments, not perfect ones, but real ones, places where different classes, generations, and personalities still physically crossed paths. As those spaces disappear, American life becomes more atomized, more isolated, more algorithmically filtered. And maybe that's one reason these closures feel emotionally heavier than they appear on paper. People sense they're not merely losing stores. They're losing environments where public life once happened naturally. But here's the uncomfortable question nobody really wants to ask. What replaces all of this? What replaces malls? What replaces community retail spaces? What replaces casual human interaction in a hyper-digital economy? Because civilizations don't stay emotionally healthy through convenience alone. Humans still need meaning, presence, belonging. And when societies fail to provide those things organically, people start searching for substitutes everywhere else. Online tribalism, political extremism, parasocial relationships, addictive consumption, endless scrolling, all filling emotional gaps left behind by disappearing real-world connection. At first glance, a store closure looks like a business decision, but zoom out far enough, and it starts looking like a civilization changing its entire psychological structure in real time. And the truly strange part? Most people can feel this transformation happening, even if they can't fully explain it yet. Maybe that's why so many Americans feel strangely nostalgic lately. Not just for old stores, for old feelings, for a version of everyday life that felt slower, steadier, more human. And nostalgia becomes powerful during periods of uncertainty, because people aren't really mourning the past itself. They're mourning predictability. That's what makes these retail closures emotionally significant. They symbolize the disappearance of environments people unconsciously assumed would always exist. Think about how many Americans grew up believing certain stores were permanent. Sears, JCPenney, Kmart, Macy's, Toys R Us. These weren't just businesses. They became landmarks inside people's memories. First jobs, holiday shopping with parents, school clothes, weekend routines, tiny emotional anchors spread across ordinary life. And now many of those anchors are vanishing. On their B1, quietly. But here's the part that deserves more attention. The closures happening in 2026 are not random accidents. They are symptoms of a larger transition America has been moving toward for decades. A transition away from a society centered around physical community spaces toward a society increasingly organized around digital convenience, financial pressure, and emotional fragmentation. And transitions like this create psychological confusion because the old system often remains visually present long after it stops functioning properly. That's why so much of America today feels oddly suspended between two eras. The infrastructure still reflects 20th century optimism, massive suburbs, gigantic parking lots, retail corridors stretching for miles, But the emotional reality underneath has changed completely. People are more financially cautious, more isolated, more skeptical of institutions, more uncertain about the future. And corporations respond to emotional reality faster than governments usually do. They see spending behavior shifting in real time. They see which zip codes are weakening, which communities are shrinking, which demographics are disengaging. Retail closures become a kind of economic map, revealing where confidence is disappearing first. And confidence matters more than most people realize. Economies don't run purely on money. They run on belief. Belief that tomorrow will be better. Belief that hard work still matters. Belief that stability is still attainable. Once belief weakens, entire systems begin behaving differently. Consumers hesitate. Businesses retreat. Communities stagnate. Young people delay milestones. Birth rates decline. Public trust erodes. All connected. And this is why the retail story matters far beyond shopping. Because stores closing across America are not isolated business events. They are physical manifestations of deeper societal anxiety. Anxiety about affordability. Anxiety about identity. Anxiety about whether the future still contains a place for ordinary people. But here's something important. Decline is never the full story. Transitions also create opportunities to rethink what actually matters. Maybe America doesn't need endless giant retail spaces anymore. Maybe people are beginning to crave experiences that feel more personal, local, and authentic. Smaller communities, independent businesses, walkable environments, human-scale interaction. Ironically, the collapse of certain retail models may eventually push society to rediscover forms of connection that mass consumer culture slowly erased. Because humans adapt. They always do. The question is whether adaptation happens consciously or accidentally. And right now, much of America feels caught in between, still attached to old economic myths, still measuring success through consumption, still trying to maintain lifestyles built for a different era, even as the ground underneath continues shifting. That tension explains why so many people today feel exhausted without fully understanding why. They're trying to emotionally operate inside systems that no longer function the way they once did. And retail workers often experience this reality first. They see fewer customers, shorter staffing, locked shelves, desperate discounts, frustrated shoppers, the slow draining of energy from places once designed to feel vibrant and abundant. In many ways, retail employees became frontline witnesses to America's emotional recession long before economists admitted anything was wrong. And maybe that's the final uncomfortable truth hiding underneath all these closures. This isn't just about corporations failing. It's about a society reaching the limits of a model built almost entirely around consumption. Because eventually, people begin asking deeper questions. What happens when buying things no longer creates optimism? What happens when convenience no longer creates fulfillment? What happens when economic growth no longer feels connected to personal meaning? Those questions are much harder to answer than quarterly earnings reports, but they may define the next decade of American life more than any retailer ever could. And somewhere tonight, another store manager is locking the doors of a location that's been open for 30 years, knowing those lights may never turn on again. Not because America suddenly collapsed overnight, but because slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, America has been changing for a very long time.